This presentation will cover the literary period that is Anglo-Saxon. We will go over characteristics of literature during this era and historical events that influenced this era. The Anglo-Saxon period can also be referred to as the Old English period, as the language used in this era region was Old English. This literary period took place between circa 650 and circa 1100 and developed mainly in Europe. Poems and songs were the most produced types of literary works during this era, with epic poetry being the most common genre of literature to have been created during this time. This literary period was influenced mostly by the wars that raged on in Europe for land and power. This warring period took a toll on the culture and society in Europe at the time, which became accurately reflected in the literature being produced then. During the Anglo-Saxon period, there was a constant fighting between different groups, more often than not over the British Isles. The first group to arrive on the islands was the Romans, who built small civilizations similar to those in their homeland. They only stayed for a few decades, just long enough to drive away the first Anglo-Saxon invasion around circa 350, then left the island to protect it. This allowed Germanic peoples such as the Jutes, Angles, and Saxons to settle in afterwards. These Germanic groups eventually established kingdoms of their own, which they eventually had to defend against later invasions. The Danish invasions occurred during the latter part of the Anglo-Saxon period. With all this turmoil and violence, subjects such as war and fighting began to make their appearance in literature. When the Romans conquered the British Isles, they introduced their religion, Christianity, to the locals. The Germanic groups, originally pagans, did not adopt this new religion until the middle of the 5th century. After living there for such a long time, they eventually began to adopt the religion and customs of the people they invaded. As there was still an occasional battle and fighting, the troubled inhabitants of the British Isles looked to books and stories for moral guidance and instructions. These provided guidelines often included Christian lessons. Christian clergymen were the few who knew how to read and write. This is also why we see more religious written texts during this era. The Germanic groups were initially seafarers, but over time adapted lives as farmers and set up small kingdoms. During this period, many people could not read, so oral storytelling played a large role in community and societal life. These stories were often about heroic warriors and fate. These stories praised warriors for their bravery and heroic behavior, reflecting the still present feelings of war. Another common theme in these stories is ubi sunt, meaning where had they gone. It was a rough, hard time of life then. It was not totally unusual to lose one's family to war, famine, or some other calamity. Although a majority of the Germanic groups began to live more peaceful lives, war and violence was always present. As the Germanic groups became more settled, they began to base their kingdoms on agriculture and took to mainly farming. They often included slave labor to help on the farms. Besides agriculture, they also began to specialize in craftsmanship and metalwork. The higher class citizens of society also contributed to the economy by hunting and making lyrics, but not as much as the lower class farmers did. Here we will look at Beowulf. This epic poem begins in media res, or in the middle of the action, common for epic poetry of the Anglo-Saxon era. The events described in the story take place in the late 5th century. In the story, Hrothgar, king of the Danes, and his people are terrorized by the monster Grendel. Beowulf, a hero of the Geats, comes to Hrothgar's aid, fighting Grendel and Grendel's mother. This story represented the feeling of honor and being a heroic warrior that most men during the era felt like they wanted to achieve. This epic also reflected the political turmoil that occurred during the wars and the newly established Germanic kingdoms. Here we will look at the Battle of Maldon. This Old English poem describes the battle between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings in 991. It is incomplete, its beginning and ending both lost. The Anglo-Saxons failed to prevent the Viking invasion in the end. This poem includes the local farmers as part of the militia and end up fighting along with the other soldiers. This reflects the transition from seafarers to farmers and Germanic groups. This transition is made evident through the farmers. This poem also demonstrates the constant aura of war that surrounded the Anglo-Saxon era. Anglo-Saxon literature preserved form, content, and values from an ancient and oral poetic tradition predating the coming of Christianity. The transition from the way of thinking and chosen religion is present in the literary works produced at the time. Of all the historical events, the eras of war and fighting played the most significant role in the development of Anglo-Saxon literature. The themes of war in the literary works reflected the feeling of heroism and transition into an agricultural kingdom.